Everyone, welcome to another episode from Ampro Engineering. This chassis here is the Trailfinder 2 Long Wheelbase Edition, and in this video we are going to take this chassis here and stretch it so that the 4-door Mojave body can have the 2 doors longer bed. Without further ado, let's get going. This is going to be a remarkably easy upgrade. These are the parts that you are going to need. All these parts are available on Shapeways right now, but they're also going to be available from my mini factory, so you can get them on both locations. 4 of the parts are mirrors of each other, so here, let me start with the front piece here. What this is going to do is simply move the front spring hangers, the rear spring hangers, the rear shock mounts, and the rear body mounts, and just shuffle them back a little bit. This bracket here is going to move the front rear spring mount. This here will move the rear spring mount. And this is our new upper mount for the rear shocks. First thing I want to do is unbolt the front rear spring hanger as well as the rear. Take off the bracket that holds the body mounts on, remove the electronics bin, and basically this is going to happen. So we'll just put this away for a moment and we'll start with the electronics bin. Now you're going to need this in order to do this upgrade. There's a couple of holes here, and those will correspond to these holes here on the electronics bin. There's also a little stud here. I should have mentioned that as well. Do not cut that off. What that does is it prevents you from over compressing this on the electronics bin. You see it'll just kind of touch off right there. So that is supposed to be there. We will go ahead and put one on each side. None of these holes should need any cleaning or tapping or drilling. These should all be ready to go. This is the new Hewlett-Packard SLS plastic, and this is incredibly durable material. Standard SLS nylon is also going to be fantastic for this application. All right, once you've got all that, we can just drop this exactly where it was before. And these little features here in the front, you see how they kind of stick out? Well, they will correspond to notches here in the chassis. So that'll just go right in. Use the same screws that held the electronics bin in the first place, and then we'll move on to mounting the front section. Once installed, this is how it's going to look. And just note that this surface will take the paint very, very well. I'm not going to bother doing that because I know a lot of people are going to ask me what's happened here, so it's a little more visible if I leave it in this gray. But now let's move on to mounting the front. I'm just going to use a couple of M3 screws, probably about 6 to 8 millimeters long, and just screw them in from the front, because for this mounting point here, the chassis is what is threaded. Now that the front rear spring mount is installed, let's install the rear shock mount. What I tried to do is use all the existing holes in the chassis. I did not want to cut or drill anything. So you can see that this will simply slot right in here and just align it to the threaded screw holes right there. And this little lip under here is simply there to make sure that there's no rotation of the shock mount. It just locks it into place. Like the front spring mount on the chassis, the shock mount that we're going to use here is already threaded. So just install the screw from the inside. Here again, I'll use an 8 millimeter long screw. The rear shock mount has been installed. You'll note as well that I've got a couple of additional mounting points here. And that's because I flipped the rear axle on my car to lower it. Therefore, I needed a lower shock mounting point in order to gain proper clearance with the chassis rail. If this is not something that you want, you can go ahead and just cut this right off using a Dremel tool. The last thing we're going to add are the rear chassis extensions, and that will go, how does it work? Like that. Wrong one. There we go. Right in here. Okay. In this application here, you are going to want to just put a screw straight through the front and a nut on the rear since nothing is threaded. All of the chassis lengthening and suspension relocation parts are in. Go ahead and install the rear body mount. That's going to go exactly where it used to using the exact same hardware. The geometry of the extensions here and the rear body mounts is exactly the same as it was originally, so any aftermarket bumper that would fit the standard Trailfinder should fit on this as well. For my application, I'm just going to install the Ampro rear tubular bumper. There's a link in the video covering this product here. Now is a good time to mount our rear axle. Now to install the rear axle, you are going to have a longer drive shaft. This is an RC4WD drive product. Part number is Z-S0523. I'll have a link in the description. But this drive shaft has a range of 120 millimeters to 150 millimeters. Got the drive shaft hooked up, and this is a very, very heavy drive shaft. Let's go ahead and just slide that underneath, and we will just line up the front mounts just like that. However, unlike the way it was originally installed, where you'd have to thread it in from the rear into a threaded chassis, you're going to have to use a nut and a bolt. The front spring mounts are installed, so that's nice and sturdy. Let's go ahead and address the rear. The rear is going to be very, very simple. You're going to use the exact same shank screw that you used before with the same nut, and that's it. All right, the rear shackle has been put back. And I think the last thing we have to do now is mount the upper part of the shock. So there are quite a number of shock mounting locations, just like the original had, and just like the original, you are going to have to tap into these. However, unlike the original, these are not tapped. You are going to have to run a screw straight through them and put a nut on the rear. And the reason for this is I felt that if the diameter was too small, that people would in fact tap into these and potentially strip them out. So the safe thing to do here is just go ahead and put a screw through it and a nut on the other side. Now for my application here, I'm simply going to use the lower mount right there. And you see that the reason why I had to do this is because had I mounted it higher, upon compression, it would have come into contact with the inner frame rail. And I did not want to grind away at the metal. I just wanted to leave it be. In my application, I'm just going to screw it right to that lower mount using, again, a screw and a nut. Upper shock mounting location is installed, and we've got all of our suspension travel back. The last thing I'm going to do is install the Ampro electronics bin here at the rear, and that'll just drop straight into place here. You are going to have to make sure that you use some fairly low profile screw heads, otherwise they can come into contact. But a lot of these dome screws are not going to have any issue whatsoever. So I'll install that, and then we're basically done. Okay, and there we have it. The complete rear suspension extension is done. To install the body, you're just going to go ahead and just drop it straight on, but you are going to have to use the longer bed from the standard Mojave body. Now, I don't want to call it the long bed because in 1-to-1 scale, this is a 6-foot bed, and the actual truck did have a 7-foot bed available, but this is a longer bed than the one that this truck originally came with. We now have an extra long wheelbase Trailfinder 2. The front bull bar on this truck is a prototype, so if you haven't seen it yet, don't worry. It's because no one actually has seen it yet. But for sneak peeks into what's coming soon from Ampro Engineering, please follow us on Instagram, because I do tend to post there very, very often as I'm working on some of these projects. Anyway, folks, thank you all so much for watching. We'll see you soon.